Thank you. I think that concludes opening statements by the members, so we'll now turn to our panel. I want to welcome you, and I ask you to come forward. We only have one panel today, but they are distinguished, and they're actually quite... Let them sit down first. I'll start on my left with Ms. Caroline Smith DeWall, who's the Food Safety Director for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and she has been dealing and calling attention and been a watchdog on this issue for a number of years. Many of your ideas have been incorporated in my bill and then into the larger bill sponsored by Mr. Dingell and Mr. Stupak and myself. Mr. William Hubbard, who is former Associate Commissioner for Policy and Planning at the Food and Drug Administration and an advisor for the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Good to see you again. Dr. Martin Cole, who was Research Professor of Biology and Director of the National Center for Food Safety and Technology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Mr. Thomas Stenzel, who's President and CEO of United Fresh Produce Association. And finally, Jim Lugg, who is former Executive Vice President, Food Safety and Quality, Fresh Express, and consultant for Chiquita Brands. So thank you all for being here, and we have 5-minute opening statements, and we'll start with Ms. DeWall.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone, and also Chairman Deal for having this hearing. I do want to recognize just the tremendous food safety leadership that's in this room, from you, Chairman Pallone, to former Chairman Dingell, Mr. Stupak, and Representatives DeGette and Eshoo. You have all been tremendous leaders, and we are thankful to be hopefully at this point of having legislation poised to really address these problems. I am the Director of Food Safety for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and we represent over 900,000 consumers, both in the U.S. and Canada. We're focused on food safety, nutrition, and even alcohol issues. Pretty much anything you put in your mouth, we worry about. The impact of the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak and recall are still reverberating through the food supply. It has caused nearly 700 confirmed illnesses and 9 deaths, and the recall of over 3,200 separate products. Despite its size and scope, this event is neither rare nor unexpected. Congress has held nearly 20 hearings in the last 2 years focused on similar failures of FDA's food program linked to everything from spinach tainted with E. coli, pet food containing an intentionally added melamine, which sickened and killed many, many animals, and even a previous peanut butter salmonella outbreak, which was thoroughly investigated in this committee. These events are causing steep declines in consumer confidence, both in the overall safety of the food supply and in FDA's ability to protect the public. Nearly half of those questioned by Consumers Union in November said their confidence in food safety had declined. Also last fall, a poll conducted by Ipsos-McClatchy reported that 28% of those polled believed food safety had gotten worse, and 46% gave food safety controls a failing grade. In July 2008, in the midst of the salmonella outbreak linked first to tomatoes and then to peppers, an Associated Press Ipsos poll found that 46% of people were worried that they might get sick from eating tainted products. Clearly, it is time for Congress to take action to fundamentally reform and fully fund our food safety system. I will now outline a couple of the essential elements that CSPI thinks need to be in any legislation moving forward to begin the process of reforming FDA's food safety program. The heart of any effective reform effort lies in prevention. not response. Legislation should include at least the following 3 components for preventing food safety problems at food processors. First, Congress should require every food plant regulated by FDA to have a food safety plan detailing that it has analyzed its operations, identified potential hazards, and is taking steps to minimize or prevent contamination. These requirements are already in place for all meat and poultry processors today, but not in plants regulated by FDA. Legislation should set risk-based inspection frequencies for food plants and establish clear auditing parameters when states are conducting inspections on behalf of the federal government. And finally, specific authority should allow the agencies to set testing frequencies and require food processors to report adverse reports to government inspectors. With this check on the plants, a company can follow without these checks on the plants, companies can follow the practices of PCA, which instead of fixing its salmonella problems, it fixed the tests. Consumer concerns extend up and down the food chain, from the farm to the table. So legislation also needs to provide on-farm food safety plans that will give farmers tools to manage risks like raw manure, unsafe water, and worker hygiene. Imported foods also pose special challenges as they enter the U.S. from all over the world, including many countries where they are essentially unregulated. CSPI supports the use of certification systems operated by foreign governments and some third parties, if they are subject to appropriate oversight by FDA. Certifiers of imported product can give FDA boots on the ground and greatly increase the agency's capacity to enforce our food safety requirements among the foreign facilities from 175 different countries that export to the U.S. President Barack Obama has promised a government that works. These new authorities, together with increased funding, will certainly help FDA improve. But to deal with the root of the problem, Congress and the Obama administration will need to go beyond making a few improvements. Structural reforms are also essential. FDA is responsible for 80% of the food supply, and yet the commissioner's attention is frequently on drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics, animal feed, many other issues that FDA regulates. Food issues frequently, unfortunately, fall to the bottom of the pile. Today, there is no single expert in charge of the policies, budget, and enforcement staff, and no credible voice communicating to the public and the industry what needs to be done to prevent outbreaks. It's time to elevate food monitoring functions within the Department of Health and Human Services. With both the public and the regulated industries clamoring for change, we are very happy to be here today and to have the tremendous leadership on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hubbard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a written statement for the records. I'll just make a few brief remarks, if I may. As you know, the public is confused and even frightened by what's going on. Imagine a fully loaded 737 crashing every other week. That's the type of toll we're talking about here, but yet we continue to tolerate the intolerable. And the public health costs have been mentioned by many of the members today, and they are very real. Suffering out there is very real. And also, I don't think we should disregard the economic costs that companies and the healthcare system are being burdened by foodborne disease outbreaks that are largely preventable. So we're allowing things to happen that we can stop. And I would like to make 2 main points about the problem. First is the issue of FDA resources. I believe I have a slide, if we could put it up, that I think really, in a way, captures the problem that FDA has gone through. Do we have that slide? When I came to the FDA in the 1970s, there were 70,000 food processors in the United States. FDA had the resources to inspect 35,000 times a year, which meant everybody could get a visit every other year. There were very few imports at the time. As you can see from this slide, we're now doing about 6,000 or 7,000 a year. But if you plotted the increase in the industry, that's gone from the 70,000 domestic firms at that period to 150,000 today, and another 216,000 foreign firms. So we've gone from inspecting about 50% of the food supply at any time to 5% of the domestic processors and about 2% of all processors. And that has largely been a function of resources. FDA's food budget has been cut and cut and cut for 30 years, and we simply need to find a way to reverse that. And you can also plot, as those numbers go the direction they go, recalls have gone up, FDA adverse findings when they do inspections have gone up, and you have a general lack of overall quality in many of these firms. I will say, however, as I say in my testimony, I think the food supply is generally safe. We have gaps, though, that are really the cause of the problem. And unless everybody does it right, no one can get it right. And then the other main point I wanted to make is authorities. FDA has authorities dating to 1906. It's essentially a relic of the 19th century. It doesn't work. It requires an inspector to perhaps catch a problem on the day he happens to get there, if he gets there at all. FDA needs the kind of preventive controls many of you have mentioned and Ms. DeWall mentioned, in which they can require a firm to examine how they make their food and control hazards so the food never gets contaminated to begin with. And those are practices that the leading food firms use now. So we're not talking about imposing on the food industry some strange new regulatory regime. We're talking about adopting industry-developed preventive control technology that has been proven to work. And then lastly, there are some other provisions that I think are very important. Traceback has been mentioned. We saw with the tomatoes last year and the spinach earlier how these outbreaks drag on for weeks or even months because FDA doesn't have adequate traceback authority. They need access to the records of these firms so they know where the food has come from and where it's going. They need mandatory recall authority. Clearly, some firms simply stall for a few days, and during that few days, while FDA is begging them to do a recall, the food is moving and being consumed. And we also need to accredit these labs that are doing a lot of the work, because you need to know you've got a high level of quality in the laboratories. There are some other things in my testimony. However, in the interest of time, I will stop there, but I certainly do urge you to act this year on food safety legislation.
Thank you. Dr. Cole.
Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Deal, good morning. I guess what I'd like to try and do, I have written testimony, I'd like to make a few remarks to try and help this committee wrestle with the complexities of the food safety systems and what approaches they should take. I really do applaud the important work and the urgency and the opening remarks that have been made this morning. Certainly we've seen, I think we're all acknowledging the complexity of the supply chain. The food business is global now. Go to the supermarket, the products can be from anywhere in the world. Global sourcing of ingredients. Look at consumer trends now, where we want people to eat healthy food. There's a trend towards more natural, fresher products, less preserved, more convenient products, longer shelf life. All of those, as a food microbiologist, they go against traditionally what you'd like to see in the marketplace. So we want food to be health, but we want it to be safe. And we certainly need to, I think as the opening remarks have mentioned, we need, we have new issues and we need a new approach, okay? We need to have a modern food safety system here in the US. I think really in simple terms there are four, I look at that in terms of four main components to a modern food safety system. First of all, risk-based preventative measures. You need programs to monitor progress. That can be trend analysis, that can be testing, inspection, even epidemiology. But you need programs to be able to monitor progress. You need appropriate government oversight. Without government oversight, you get the issues that we've got in peanut butter and salmonella. And then lastly, you need a strong research program, because things are changing so fast. If you don't have a world-class research program, you can't deal with issues proactively and deal with them swiftly. Dealing with microorganisms, as I'm a microbiologist by training, deal with microorganisms is even more complicated because they're alive, okay? So bacteria have the ability to grow and survive and adapt throughout the food chain. So when we're designing food safety systems, we need to be cognizant of the ability of bacteria to change and to grow and adapt. So that adds another complexity with what we're dealing with. Now, in response to these issues, I mean, this is not just a US issue. Internationally, the food safety community has responded by developing new tools, risk-based tools, to try and ensure the safety of the food supply. And it's now possible through modeling and risk assessment to be able to link the level of hazard or the prevalence of a hazard in a food supply to the likely illness that it's likely to cause. And that's allowed us to develop new risk management frameworks that will provide the scientific underpinning to the development of risk management options, the science behind the frequency of inspections, etc. So these new developments we need to be using. It's ironic that you know, in the US, much of these developments have been led by US scientists, and yet we need to start walking the talk here. Yeah? So we've done a good job, I think, in tracking sporadic cases of foodborne illness through new tools, food safety net, pulse field gel electrophoresis, fingerprinting, if you like, of organisms, but we're really falling behind in the prevention side, and that's really where we need to up our game. A quick word about oversight, testing, and inspection. I think the short answer is you can't test and inspect safety into food. Okay? You need that oversight, because without that, you get the PCA issue. But testing alone, think of the issue with salmonella, where a very low infective dose can give you an illness. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. The statistics of sampling are such that you can't test safety into food. Think also of the volume of foods that are coming into the US now. What is it? Over 60% of fresh produce, fruit and vegetables coming to the US from overseas, over 80% of seafood coming from overseas. You know, we need to be practical about the percentage of foods we can realistically inspect. We need the inspection there as a deterrent, but we need to be smart about where we use those resources, and we need to use them in where the highest risks are. And now, in industry, there are two main tools for really applying and implementing risk-based measures. And they're, as was mentioned before, these are standard tools that have been adopted through Codex. The two main tools are Good Manufacturing Practice, or GMP, and Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP. And you can think of GMP as like the building blocks, the standard operating procedures for sanitary design, equipment, people, labeling, recall procedures, etc. Many of the recall issues that we see from FDA, actually, if you look at whether GMP would deal with them or whether HACCP would, many of them actually you would deal with GMP, and it's an oversight issue that we've got. So we need to think about where we should be using GMP and also where we should be using HACCP. HACCP is a more systematic approach, identifying and evaluating the food safety hazards. It's usually more quantitative in nature, usually defining a critical control point in the food chain that you must control to reduce, eliminate, and prevent hazards. Typically, in a value chain, you'd be looking at a performance standard for HACCP as well. Now, I also have one slide to share with the committee this morning. If I could take that. I think it's a good lead into some other testimony relating to fresh produce. If we can go to slide 3, please. That's great. So really, this, I think, kind of illustrates a good lead into the next witness. If you look at the complexity of the supply chain for fresh produce, you can't pasteurize lettuce, okay? You'd have lettuce soup if you were to do that, okay? So that there isn't one kill step in the chain. So you have to take a through-chain approach. You have to take good agricultural practice. You have to look at what you're doing in terms of washing of the produce, and you have to look at what you're doing in terms of the distribution. So I just wanted to share with you, this is a complex business. There's research going on at the moment between industry and government to really try and come up with the risk management options that would build some robustness into the value chain for fresh produce. This is a category of food we want people to eat more of, okay? Hugely impactful in terms of nutrition, and yet we need to build more robustness in terms of safety. My final comment, Mr. Chairman, is around research. You know, the US, I think, should be really at the forefront of research in terms of the safety and health of food. It's such an important driver of public health, but also very important in terms of trade for the US. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Mr. Stenzel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a slide, but I'll thank Dr. Cole for sharing on behalf of the fresh produce industry, and I will affiliate myself with his remarks. In my written testimony, I've provided a number of specific policy provisions that I will call to the committee's attention, but I'd like to spend just a few minutes this morning talking a bit more personally about some of these issues. First, I'd encourage all of you to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. At a time when Congress is debating health care reform, all public health authorities agree that one of the most important things we can do to improve health is to eat more fruits and vegetables. But achieving that goal is dependent upon the main issue that we're talking about today, and that's the critical challenge to modernize and reform food safety law. Now, I personally am confident in my produce choices today. We consume over 1 billion servings of fresh produce every day in the United States, over 5 million bags of salad every day. And out of the hundreds of different produce items in the supermarket, a very small number, only 5, have been related to any type of foodborne disease in recent years in quantity. But we also know that we have issues. Consumers know it, and consumers are fearful of fresh produce at the moment, and that's something we've got to address. Now, our industry has been working in this area for many, many years, but the spinach crisis almost 3 years ago now was a watershed moment for us. Remember the unprecedented national response. We pulled spinach off of the shelves of every grocery store in America for weeks. But in fact, we now know the only contaminated product came from one farm through one processing plant on one day's production, even one afternoon shift. It wasn't even the whole day. There's been no contamination from that processing plant or from spinach in the last 2.5 years. And yet today, spinach consumption is still down in the United States, one of the healthiest vegetables that we should all be consuming. Following that outbreak, we undertook a mission. First, to look at a comprehensive reevaluation of all of our leafy greens production. Mr. Lugg will talk about that, and his leadership in that area of our industry has been tremendous. We looked at every possible step and have adopted the most rigorous good agricultural practices with strong compliance measures and audits, some conducted by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, but also other states and private sector auditors. But our industry also had to address the broader question of federal regulation. In January of 2007, our Board of Directors adopted a series of policy principles for mandatory federal oversight of our business. Let me explain the 3 principles briefly. First, we believe produce safety standards must allow for commodity-specific food safety practices based on the best available science. In a highly diverse industry that's more aptly described as hundreds of little industries, one size clearly does not fit all. For example, food safety requirements applicable to products grown close to the ground would be very different from food safety practices for fruit grown on trees. Secondly, we believe produce safety standards must be consistent for any individual commodity wherever it was grown or processed, anywhere in the United States or imported into the country. Consumers must have confidence that the same safety standards were applied no matter whether the produce is grown in California, New Jersey, or Mexico. Finally, we believe achieving consistent produce safety standards across the industry does require strong federal government oversight and responsibility. That's going to take credibility for consumers, and it's also going to create equity for producers across all of our industry. The FDA must determine the most appropriate nationwide safety standards in an open and transparent process with full input from the states, industry, academia, consumer groups, and all stakeholders. Most of my testimony this morning has been about prevention. Preventive controls are where it's at. That's what we've got to do. As Dr. Cole said, we're not going to test food safety into our products. But I do have to take just one moment to talk about outbreak investigations as well. When I testified before the O&I subcommittee last summer in the midst of the jalapeno outbreak, I raised several issues that were critical, and I think the peanut paste fiasco of the last several months continues to reinforce those. It's clear that no one is in charge of these outbreak investigations. There's no chain of command. There's no command and control procedure. And American consumers and industry alike are left to be whipsawed back and forth from momentary change to change. Crisis planning is not done in advance. It seems to be learned on the job. The government's failure to use industry expertise, at least in our case, to help reduce and end the outbreak last summer was a tragedy. Now, let me say that this needs to be transparent. It's got to be supported by consumer groups, and it's got to be a squeaky clean system. But there is expertise in industry that can help reduce, moderate, and end outbreaks, even in the tragic situations when they occur. And we've got to find a way for CDC and FDA to take advantage of that expertise. Finally, risk communication is critical. The principle of timely and rapid communication with the press and public cannot be underestimated. But it's also critical that any risk communication expert would advise precision and care in communicating exactly what needs to be said and not speculating. One single office at FDA needs to have the authority and accountability for public communications with one single officer designated as the media spokesperson. Let me conclude. There is a public health imperative that we consume more fresh produce. We as an industry are doing everything we possibly can to make sure that we're delivering safe and healthy products. But because science tells us there's no such thing as zero risk, government must also be able to assure the public that our food safety systems are based on the best available science and are enforced by strong and appropriate oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stenzel. Mr. Lugg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jim Lugg. I am former Executive Vice President of Food Safety and Quality at Fresh Express, and today a consultant to Chiquita Brands International. The strategy or food safety plan is a requirement for any company that's in the food business, and it must be a solid one, and it must be adhered to. Regular reviews of that food safety plan are required so that we're constantly updating it for new risks that we've become aware of. In our business, in Fresh Express, we have to look at really three areas. One is the production area, second is harvesting, and third is processing. Each of those areas are unique unto themselves and require specialized plans. But these reviews that we do in these three areas are what help us identify risks and prevent contamination from occurring. More importantly, I think the overall lesson we've learned from these plans are that we have to do a very good job at focusing on preventive efforts. That means that in our case, we have really four things that we look at. Where are we planting the crop? What is the environment surrounding the crop along with its creatures? Third, what kind of water will we use to irrigate with and then process it with? And finally, all along that supply chain, we have the worker issue, worker hygiene. But again, I stress the fact that even though we have a robust plan and we have been doing fresh cut lettuce since 1978, we constantly must update that plan so as we can identify new risks that we didn't realize because of new science or whatever the case may be. But I can point out that a simple case that you can all identify with, I think. If we have a lot of lettuce that we're ready to harvest and one of our people can identify what seems to be an animal incursion into that field of product, we have two choices. If we can clearly identify where the incursion occurred, we can avoid harvesting that product. If we can't clearly identify that risk, we abandon the field completely. But I emphasize that this issue of risk evaluation is a never-ending process in the food industry. And that's true whether it's fresh, whether it's frozen, or whether it's canned. Almost without fail, these risk evaluations lead to more effective preventive steps, and that's the bottom line. And I also would emphasize that these food safety plans, at least in our company, where we handle a number of different vegetables, are not transferable. Lettuce is different from tomato, so they must be commodity specific. And then I want to go on and just mention that in our company, when we do identify a risk, we focus intently on how to manage that risk and how to evaluate whether our management practices are safe. This requires a lot of record keeping, what has been measured, when it was measured, and all those sorts of details. But the important point I want to make is that once the risks are identified, the preventive process controls must be put in place and then measured for their effectiveness. I also want to conclude actually by saying that we have a lot of tools that we can use to measure our effectiveness, such as third-party audits, testing, inspections, and so forth. And these tools are very effective in helping us evaluate how well we're doing. But the one thing I want to just give you a simple example of in closing is an acre of spinach has more or less 3 million plants in it. The typical practice for sampling a spinach field to measure, see if a pathogen is present, is to collect something less than 100 plants from that acre of 3 million plants. You can calculate for yourself how challenging the odds are of finding a pathogen in that sort of a regime. Finally, and just to summarize, I believe the FDA should insist on every food company having a very current food safety plan. Secondly, the FDA should satisfy itself that regular risk evaluations are being done. Third, FDA should have access to preventive action steps that have been taken to manage the risk. And finally, my message is it's all about prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Logan. Thanks to all the panel. We'll have 5 minutes questions from each member who desires.